Commission statement. And first, on behalf of the Council, but the Council is not present yet, so therefore I give floor to Commissioner Moscovici.
Thank you, Vice President, honourable members. I'm very pleased to be here on behalf of Mr. Juncker, who will speak before you tomorrow, in order to tell you about my impression of the G20 Summit in Hangzhou in China last week. The EU was represented, as always, by President Juncker and by President of Council, Donald Tusk, who I had the pleasure of accompanying, giving the economic agenda of the summit. And of course, the Economic and Financial Commissioner always accompanies the President at the G20 Summit. So in China, we wanted to show a good sense of organization. We wanted to show global responsibility that it's assuming as a key actor in the world economy. Now, for the G20, this was the opportunity after years of crisis to demonstrate that we can take more offensive political decisions to guarantee sustainable long-term growth and to reestablish confidence. I think that this challenge in this context was important and was taken up. We presented a certain number of subjects where the EU is a leader. I'm thinking of everything that has to do with global growth in order to pursue the structural reforms, but also to stand as an example in the area of fighting tax evasion and to be a promoter of international trade and defender of investment. And these subjects were the priority for the main world leaders. And our strategy was to demonstrate that our European triangle, investment, structural reforms, and responsible public financing, does function. But that's going to continue to guarantee a change which is sustainable and positive in the long term. Now, maybe I might sound complacent, but no, of course not. It was stated many times by most of the speakers during the 2 days in Hangzhou as an appeal to act urgently to supply tangible results to our citizens who expect them. Our large economies are closely linked, and world growth is slow and is facing multiple obstacles. The risk of a vicious circle is identified: growth, productivity, inequality, which seems to be growing, and this produces a populist response, and therefore we have to get the growth going. So the G20 decided to utilize all political tools, monetary, budgetary, structural tools, to stimulate growth and to stress reforms. And cooperation was launched on innovation, on the digital economy to increase productivity and growth in the long term. And the leaders in the G20 delivered a strong message. After a period of lengthy crisis, we have to think about the future. Benefits of growth, globalization, innovation, they have to be appreciated by everyone, not only by a group of some privileged people or countries. So I've been participating in Summit for some years, and a concept has grown in public debate, and that's the concept of inclusion, a fundamental principle putting the stress on competence, on social protection, and on the definition of budgetary policies, trade policies, and others that have to take account this parameter of inclusive growth. Now, the priorities of this Commission, like that of the G20, are already turned towards social justice. Now, trade was, of course, on the agenda as well. International trade is a prime mover for growth and employment. So that's why we're concerned with growth at world level. That's why we'll continue to vigorously defend free trade against the protectionist temptations that we're seeing in many places. But the Commission has also emphasized the fact that free trade has to be fair in order to get the support of this Parliament and of our people. It has being in favor of free trade does not mean being in favor of free trade, whatever its conditions or terms or consequences. Now, G20 supports a multilateral trade system which is solid, based on respective rules. And so we emphasize that aspect of things in our discussions in the G20. And the President of the Commission personally committed himself in a combat which I know the Parliament supports, which is defending the interests of the European steel industry and the workers affected by this context of overcapacity at global level and overcapacity in China. And this is a question where progress was made under the G20 agreement to create a world forum on steel capacity with the support of the OECD and the approval of the Chinese president. So, fair international taxation, too, that's another condition which is essential to restore the confidence of our citizens in the world economy and to make it possible for governments to supply the investments and services which are so necessary to our economies. All of our enterprises, and I repeat this often as Commissioner responsible for taxes, have to pay their fair share in the countries where they make their profits. You know that the European Union is spearheading these efforts, and that last year we already adopted several ambitious proposals. We were encouraged to see all the countries in the G20 once again firmly committed not only to implement past agreements but to go even further. In the aftermath of the Panama Papers, and which does weigh in our minds, the G20 agreed to establish a list of non-cooperative jurisdictions and for the next summit in 2017 to consider measures complementary to the G2 list and the list that the EU is planning to launch, which also has to be operational by 2017 with complementary sets of problems but which can go hand in hand. Then concerning fighting the financing of terrorism, the leaders want to implement its new strategy against terrorist financing and to strengthen coordination with those who don't participate in the task force, and especially the vulnerable countries. Now, at the Hangzhou meeting, we discussed the reform of financial regulations, which was a prime initiative of the G20. Emphasis now being put on a consistent implementation of the reforms agreed on, like the Basel III, and finalizing it by the end of this year. The Chinese presidency also went into structures of international financial architecture. There's a risk for the financial community. We want to maintain a strong IMF with sufficient resources, and that's an appreciable result. Last year at Tallinn, the G20 was called on to recognize the refugee crisis for what it is, needing a global response. And the EU and the G20 set up measures to manage this crisis, but we can only take this challenge if the global community also makes coordinated efforts. So we had a clear message for our partners in G20, that is to say that we want the level of solidarity between the countries, which is necessary to solve these problems, really can come about. And of course we are resolutely optimistic. That is that the G20 leaders said that they were prepared to take on the burden of this refugee crisis with financial aid and the resettlement of the refugees, and the cooperation of the G20 to guarantee food safety and poverty alleviation in Africa. Especially that's important to control the migration flows. We also recommitted to the Paris Agreement. Ratification is going well, and the threshold of the coming into force of the agreement will be achieved this year, probably. And the main message of the European Union here to the G20 is that they have to act now, rapidly, to implement the agreement. And of course, a lot of leaders at the summit wanted to hear the answer of the Europeans to the referendum in the UK. President Juncker reassured them, saying that we were prepared to face up to this once the British government told us of its intentions. You know that the Commission has appointed its negotiator, my predecessor, French Commissioner, Mr. Michel Barnier. We want to have a new partnership with the UK, which will function to the benefit of everyone. I mean, of course, the UK will no longer be a member of the European Union, but will remain a decisive European country for a lot of policies that we have to pursue together at the same time. The President emphasized that there are a lot of things that the EU of the 27 can do together, and that's our objective for the future. And it's in this spirit that the President will speak to you tomorrow for his State of the Union speech. And he'll talk about the Europe of the 28, which is still our Europe, then the Europe of the 27, which is our future, and the Europe of the 19, the Eurozone, which is the very core of Europe. Now, I can't anticipate what he'll say, but this will be an important moment for the Commission, for the Parliament, for the EU, before the meeting of the leaders of the 27th, which will be held in Bratislava on the 16th of September. So that's what I had to say to you about the G20 Summit. Of course, I can come back to this later. I think this G20 Summit was organized extremely well by the Chinese, very well led by the Chinese President, and with results which were very good, which go along the lines of what the European Union might have expected. Thank you very much.
Commissioner Moscovici, and now we will continue, and maintenant, Madame Grossette, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Commissioner, it is truly regrettable that the Council is not here to talk about the last G20 subject, at which a lot of statements of principle were made, but wasn't really convincing in terms of results. As the Commissioner said, I think we can be happy about the fact that Europe has managed to impose its economic agenda, and the roadmap adopted at the summit overlaps to a great extent with the priorities that have been established by our group, the European People's Party, and on which we have been working for many months: justice, tax justice, the fight against inequality, promoting trade within the framework of regulated globalization, and a growth agenda based on structural reform and investment. And there was also a small victory on the question of steel overcapacity at a global level, because that was finally put on the agenda. And I think it is significant that this subject was discussed in China, a country where subsidies are feeding a huge amount of dumping, which has really had a very damaging effect on the European steel industry. Unfortunately, a lot of other crucial subjects were not addressed or only touched on. For example, the refugee crisis. You talked about it, Mr. Moscovici, but really, even if we need to be optimistic, I think what was achieved was very limited. And then climate change. Yes, there was a statement about the ratification of the Paris Agreement from the US and China, but we are waiting for the actual effect of that. And then the war in Syria. And then another subject which is mentioned in a few words in the final declaration, and that is the fight against bioresistance. There is no firm commitment that we heard on that, even though this is one of the great scourges of our century. This really is something which requires serious action, and I think we can see that the summit really didn't produce very much. And even the fight against populism, there once again what was achieved was not, and what we heard was not very reassuring. However, promises were made, and they will be minding, and I hope that those who actually made these promises will stick to them. Really, the only point of this summit was to demonstrate once again how powerful China is. It is the international actor, whether we like it or not.
Merci, et maintenant.
Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Bolsonaro.
Yes, yes, Okay, I will give the floor to Council, Mr. Korčok.
Thank you, Madam President. Your honourable members, I'm grateful for the invitation to discuss the outcomes of the G20 Summit, which took place last week in China and where the European Union was represented by President Tusk and President Juncker. G20 leaders discussed various topics of global importance and crucially issues on which the G20 should provide leadership. I will focus on issues which I find are of particular relevance from the point of view of the Council, including migration, the global economy, trade, taxation and climate. Ladies and gentlemen, let me start with an issue which is very high on our agenda, namely the management of migration. I consider the G20th recognition of the current crisis as an issue of global concern to be a very positive signal. The EU has stated in international fora on various occasions that migration requires efficient and coordinated action, and it calls for the responsibility of all the stakeholders in a spirit of partnership and burden sharing. The EU and its member states fully assume their responsibilities but expect other partners, namely our G20 partners, to also do their part. The communiqué from G20 leaders is a step in the right direction by calling for scaled-up support to refugees and host communities. The EU will certainly use the opportunity of the forthcoming summit on refugees and migration in New York, which you will discuss with High Representative Mogherini later today, to take forward the G20 conclusions and pursue a more equitable sharing of responsibility for what is clearly a global challenge. My second point is on the global economy. G20 leaders in China pointed to the progressing global economic recovery while recognizing that growth was still weaker than desirable and that downside risks remained. Challenges originating from geopolitical developments were also mentioned. Accordingly, leaders declared their determination to use all policy tools, monetary, fiscal and structural, individually and collectively to achieve the intended growth. Importantly, there was the recognition that growth needs to be inclusive in order to ensure that it serves the needs of everyone and benefits all countries and people so that no one is left behind. This is recognized in the Hangzhou Action Plan, which summarizes the main commitments by G20 members. The G20 Summit also made a strong case for international trade as a driver of global economic recovery. To this end, G20 leaders committed to strengthen an open world economy by working towards trade and investment facilitation and liberalization. The establishment of G20 Trade and Investment Working Group is an important step in this regard. The G20 reaffirmed its commitment to the multilateral trading system, which the WTO at its core, and to advancing the post-Nairobi work in the WTO, including an outstanding issues of Doha Development Round, with a view to achieving positive outcomes at the next WTO Ministerial Conference in 2017. I also welcome the G20 commitment to ratify the Trade Facilitation Agreement by the end of this year, and its call for other WTO members to do the same. The EU, for its part, has already ratified. However, we need to recognize that anti-globalization sentiment and opposition to trade is increasing. The G20 therefore emphasized the need to communicate the benefits of trade and open markets more effectively and ensure the benefits of trade are spread more widely. The G20 also recognized the structural problems caused by excess capacity in some industries, most notably in the steel sector, and agreed that this required a collective response. G20 leaders therefore agreed to establish a global forum on steel access capacity, which should report to the relevant G20 ministers in 2017. Ladies and gentlemen, let me mention two more issues. Taxation. This is another priority the EU shares with the G20. I particularly welcome the establishment of the G20 OECD inclusive framework for implementation of base erosion and profit shifting initiative, or BEPS, as well as its first meeting in Kyoto. The EU has pioneered BEPS implementation with the recent adoption of the directive against tax avoidance practices, but a timely, consistent and widespread implementation of the BEPS package at global level remains critical in order to establish an international level playing field and avoid further loopholes. I am also satisfied with the endorsement of the proposal for objective criteria to identify non-cooperative jurisdiction with respect to tax transparency, and with the objective to prepare by July 2017 a list of jurisdictions that have not yet sufficiently progressed towards a satisfactory level of implementation, as well as to consider defensive measures against them. Following the adoption of conclusions on taxation last May, the Council has already started to determine, on the basis of a first screening by the Commission, non-cooperative third country jurisdictions with whom dialogue should begin during the course of next year. The objective is to establish an EU list of such jurisdictions and explore defensive measures at the EU level in the tax as well as in the non-tax area to be endorsed by the Council by the end of this year. Finally, the G20 Summit reaffirmed the commitment of its members to sustainable development and strong and effective action to tackle climate change. The G20 leaders committed to countries to ratifying and implementing in a timely fashion all aspects of the Paris Climate Agreement, including financial assistance for developing countries. Notably, the G20 supported efforts to enable the Paris Agreement to enter into force by the end of 2016. Thank you very much for your attention, Madam President and dear honourable members.
I will give the floor to Mrs. Mosca.
Thank you very much. There need to be rules, there needs to be inclusion that stems from the G20, but these rules need to be rolled out so that this doesn't remain hot air. Globalisation means that we as the EU need first and foremost to breathe new life into new globalisation, which takes account of global phenomena, the impact of trade agreements, digital evolution and migratory flows, and takes the right corrective steps so that nobody is sidelined. We need to share because we need rules and trust among partners. The institutions of a form controlling access to steel is a first positive step. Inclusion. Everybody needs to be on board and play their own role. This means that for the very first time, this summit acknowledges the importance of inclusion of women as drivers for growth. Elements of old.
Speak a little bit.
Yeah.
Given the failure of old-school globalization, we need to not enact protectionism. It's up to us to come up with a fresh proposal, keeping the world together without leaving anybody by the wayside.
Thanks. And now I will give the floor to Mr. Lunes.
Thank you, Madam President. In the G20 communique, it says that the global economy is recovering, but when you read between the lines, you can see that they're not all that convinced about that themselves, because they're asking for more government investment. In the weekend newspapers, the headlines were, finally, the austerity policy has failed, it's not working, and that was also very much the theme of the meeting with Mr. Tsipras in Athens this weekend. But with all respect, truth also has its rights. Global debt has not decreased since 2008. On the contrary, the debt of companies, banks, households, and particularly governments has grown. At the moment, there is $200 billion in debt in the world. That is more than 3 times the total world economy. So let's not have the wool pulled over our eyes. We can have more investment, but first of all, we have to make cuts to make that investment possible.
Thanks. And now Mr. TELIČKA.
Madam Chair, Commissioner, Minister, thank you for the briefing that we have kindly received. I don't want to reiterate what has been said. I think that there are a number of important points. I would say that the reconfirmed commitment to growth, innovation, facilitation of investment, liberalization of free trade are of course highly relevant. I also appreciate that China committed itself to free trade, to fight protectionism, and of course the decision to set up a global monitoring entity for the overproduction of steel is highly relevant, especially nowadays for Europe. In this respect, it would be interesting to know from the Commissioner what will proceed the work on the multilateral level, how we're going to perceive it, and whether the Commission has already thought of the technicalities. I mean, I'm missing maybe a bit more on 2 points. Refugees, well, Minister, you have devoted some time to it. I think that the recognition of the problem might not be entirely sufficient. The second issue, we know that Putin met Obama on the sideline of the summit, and a deal has been brokered on ceasefire. But I wonder why we do not have anything in the conclusions from the G20 summit, and I think that both on refugee crisis as well as on this doesn't send the best signal. But my main point is the following. While there is a commitment to free trade, I wonder how credible the EU is in reconfirming it with its international partners if at the same time, on one hand we say multilateral liberalisation, bilateral agreements and so on, and on the other side we have voices in Germany, in France, elsewhere in Europe, basically calling TTIP an important free trade agreement being basically dead. So I wonder, I think that we know what the Commission had to say, but I wonder how the Council, how the Presidency will pick up that issue, because this is definitely a hit to the credibility of the European Union. Thank you.
And now Mr. Papadimoulis.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Moscovici. In China, we saw a series of declarations which were extremely interesting at the final of the G20 summit. However, what citizens want is to go from words to acts, tangible acts, not just words. They want there to be quantifiable results and not just rhetoric. As to the question of tax evasion, the decision of the Commission was very right concerning the taxes that Apple needs to pay in endeavouring to evade taxes by declaring in Ireland. We need action. We need facts. And there has to be cooperation too, global cooperation in relation to the refugee crisis. But how can we say that we're giving an example when the EU can't even live up to its own obligations among the member states? When there are countries that are not resettling or relocating refugees, and they're letting the whole burden fall on my country, Greece, to register refugees. And then we've got the problem of investment and tax evasion. In Europe, tax evasion is 7 times more than the budget of the European Union. We're talking about more than €1 billion a year, so we need action. We need facts. And the Council has to explain to us why in an important meeting like this things were just delayed.
Mr. Bütikofer, the floor is yours.
Frau Präsidentin.
Madam President, Council Representative, Commissioner, colleagues, I'm very grateful to the Council representative for having arrived late, because that gave us an opportunity to get off to a very good start and find out from Mr. Moscovici what his stance is on the budget bingo. He said that there had been agreement reached on long-term sustainable growth, and said that Europe is in a very good position in terms of growth, that it's in the lead, and that the Commission managed to place an emphasis on the social aspect of things, and they were quite right to do that. Mr. Moscovici, I think what you're doing here is reporting from a parallel universe. You said that the results of the Hangzhou summit were fully in line with the EU's expectations, and I think that is the most pathetic thing that could be said, because that simply means that business as usual is good enough for the EU. Apart from a few small points on which progress was made, for example, the Steel Forum on overcapacity, which has already been mentioned, or the fact that on green finance there is still some cooperation there that hasn't been completely buried. Apart from that, this summit really produced no substantive results. But what it did make clear is that in this kind of a global event, Europe is only playing second violin. There has been a lot of claims made about these summits. But if China doesn't accept the arbitration ruling of the UNCLOS panel, I think we should treat it as a pariah. I think that Russia should be ostracized because of the role it is continuing to play in Ukraine and in Crimea. But that wasn't talked about at all at the summit. China and Russia were at the very heart of the summit, whereas the EU was simply on the backbenches. So I think that we have to stop being so complacent, as if business as usual were good enough for us, if we really want to change things. The EU hasn't managed to ratify the climate agreement. The Chinese and the Americans have made a big show of this in Hangzhou, and that shows how secondary our role is. And I think you have expressed that extremely well, Commissioner, and that will ensure that things don't change, the stance that you've taken.
Thank you, Madam President. What happened in China did not yield the results we ought to have expected from such a summit. The world situation is extremely serious and needs answers, quite apart from some useful stances which have emerged, but not a lot else has been done. I would like to underscore a few positive elements and recall the problems which persist, particularly when it comes to emissions. Looking at the situation in the EU, we must show that we can act, that we can be players, credible players on the world stage. We need to sincerely fight against climate stains. After the ratification of the Paris Agreement by the main international polluters, USA and China among them, the EU needs to see to it that all member states follow through and bring pressure to bear to ensure that third countries also follow suit. Therefore, we need to look at the initiative on green finance and the proposal to look for clean energy solutions having a significant quota of non-fossil fuels. We would call upon the Commission to follow through on the circular economy proposal. The statement whereby an open and resilient financial system will be set up based on international cooperation when it comes to taxing and financial taxation. Well, this is something we must act upon. However, this does need to be acted upon rapidly. The Parliament needs to sink its teeth into these issues, and the Commission needs to act immediately under the 27 Action Programme work plan.
ATKINSON, the floor is yours.
Okay. At the recent G20 meeting, my Prime Minister Theresa May expressed the UK's determination to once again be a global leader in free trade. Now that the UK will soon unshackle itself from the EU, it will be able to reach out to our Commonwealth partners, which it couldn't before because of EU restrictions. Africa, kept in poverty by aid by this place, will instead be able to free trade again with the UK. India and Australia, representing major markets, have already shown their interest in a free trade deal. China, another huge market, is equally ready to look into a free trade deal with my country. If a tiny country such as Switzerland even has a trade deal with China, then surely the UK can have one as well, and it will. All the while, the EU has no trade deal with major markets around the world. You exclude Russia because of your stupid sanctions. I hope my country reopens trade negotiations with Russia, and we will continue to have a good relationship with them. The EU dictates the trade policies of European countries, and unsurprisingly, with meagre results. Unless you believe that a few deals done with the EU that did manage to negotiate with countries such as Morocco, Papua New Guinea and Algeria are game changers. Of course, you do have your secret TTIP negotiations, and how's that going, by the way? Your friend Obama tries to push through TTIP, and that mostly serves the interests of multinationals. It doesn't serve the people. TTIP will end up in the bin, as the French and German ministers have already publicly announced that it's dead in the water. I'm not gloating over these failures, but I do want to point out that the EU has a bad track record and has failed the peoples of the EU. Member States have their hands tied behind their backs because an unelected Commission is deciding for you. I bet the UK will have a trade deal with all major economies across the globe before the EU, and yes, even with the USA. Obama will soon leave office, and a new US government will be more than happy to sign a trade deal with the UK, just like the rest of the world.
And now, Mr. Gollnisch, the floor is yours.
Well, what can we see from the results of the G20? Well, there was a lot to be said in the countries of steel surpluses who dump onto the world market with the consequences that we're aware of here in terms of elimination of jobs. Now, the Chinese president was against any idea of barriers to trade or protectionism. He defends his studies, but we don't defend ours. No, in environmental terms, of course, the Paris Agreement was signed by China and the United States, but we learned at the same time that Turkey programmed the construction of 80 coal-fired power plants, and the Chinese are not giving up their thermal plants between now and 2030. The situation in Syria hardly progressed either, despite this partial, fragile ceasefire which has taken place. In the G20, they communicated a lot. They talked about ethics and morals, and talked terribly sincerely. They wanted to get growth going, and they wanted to combat populism. And Mrs. Grossette talked about this, but the problem is that fighting against populism means fighting against the people.
Thanks. And now, Mr. Kaspari.
Madam President, it's interesting to read the final document of the G20 and then to hear the statements of Council and Commission and to compare those with reality. Just to give you a couple of examples, for years the G20 has been talking about tax justice and tax fairness. In the European Union, we are not making any progress at all. And if we had a competition commissioner who would try and put a brake on this, because of the fact that the member states are not addressing this. Despite that, we are not making progress on this. But what Mrs. Vestager has been doing is at least a small bit of good news. Secondly, we talk about investment and the need to strengthen investment. But if you look in practice what we are doing in Europe, we talk about strengthening investment, but to finance the Juncker plan, we take money from extending broadband infrastructure in Europe, and in doing so, we hit those who most need European structural funds, our rural areas. They depend on this development. The third point then is structural reform. Once again, we hear a lot of statements on this, and it's a shame that in my country, some structural reforms which were carried out 10 to 15 years ago are now being rolled back now. But when you look at the other countries, France, Italy, etc., my outside view of this is that no progress has been made on structural reform, that they're at a standstill. On trade, we talk about trade facilitation agreements and the fact that we want to improve trade, but then we see that at the same time as the G20 summit is taking place, that our member states are damaging the good agreement that we have between the EU and Canada because of the lack of progress in negotiating on this agreement. So I would like to see something more than statements. I think we should really try to translate these statements into action, and I think here the Council, unfortunately the Commission, is failing totally in a lot of areas.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Monsieur le Commissaire, distinguished colleagues, the G20 summit in Hangzhou was a pretty successful one, and I would like to express a few words to congratulate China for the way they organized and presided. The S&D Group certainly welcomes the decisions in the key sectors like fair taxation, refugee crisis, terrorism, and also the commitments to solve the problem of overproduction, especially in the steel sector. But as we know, one thing is taking decisions, and a totally different one is putting them into practice. And this is what we really miss. We are very happy about the stance taken by the Commission against Apple in Ireland, because for the S&D Group, fair taxation is a key element for the wealthy and competitive economy. But it is evident that together with measures to be taken at the EU level, we need to act globally in order to make sure that the rules are becoming binding for all. And this is where Europe should assume its own responsibility as an important actor of the international community. One key message deriving from the G20, but more in general from the global economic situation, is that we need more growth, and we cannot expect just developing countries to be the ones leading the process. The EU needs to do much in order to relaunch the growth in the economy, to create more jobs, and with more flexibility and more investments. The G20 was also an occasion for the US and China to jointly ratify, and I will underline, symbolically jointly ratify the Paris Agreement on climate change. This is an area where Europe was always taking lead. But let me say that this last time, United States and China go there first. They are the two biggest world polluters, but maybe this is equally a sign that world change, and Europe should draw its own lessons, because no one European member state ratified the Paris Agreement. And this is once again the difference between nice speeches and the little action which is so much needed for the European citizens and for the survival of the European project. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks. And now Mr. Marias. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Chair. The main result of the G20 summit is that the world leaders did not take up the subject of a fair distribution of wealth in the world and how to put an end to poverty, which affects the whole planet. And we have to take these measures not just for more reasons, but because poverty is hard on demand, of course. And we also have to put an end to tax evasion at international level. We have to take measures in relation to global debt, which is reaching heights we've never seen before. We have to adopt measures also concerning the European steel plants, also concerning refugees. There only fine declarations were made, but no measures were proposed that might actually grapple with the problem. As to the subject of steel, they only decided to decide on a quota, and they didn't decide to take measures against China, which is responsible for what's happening there.
The next speaker will be Mr. Selimovic.
Thank you, Madam President.
Well, this G20 summit had a very ambitious heading: to foster an innovative, invigorated, interconnected, inclusive world economy. I was glad that the global leaders were aware that today's challenges need this kind of ambition, but unfortunately it stopped there. The final declaration doesn't have one binding measure and is rather a demonstration that the 20 biggest economies in the world don't know how they're going to agree on facing up to these challenges. How otherwise can you interpret the following sentence: we support effort to promote voluntary knowledge diffusion and technology transfer on mutually agreed terms and conditions. I mean, really. Not a single word on how, on who, on when, on with what. We're living in a time of enormous populism. We desperately need growth to get out of this xenophobic trap we've ended up in. We need to handle the refugee crisis, Syria, Russia, the climate, epidemics, racism, and the only thing the 20 most important leaders of the world said was to talk about voluntary knowledge diffusion. I mean, really. The G2 summit demonstrated the lack of a common denominator and shows that the EU and the G20 leaders are not up to it. And then it's not so strange that voters protest and vote for populists who promise everything. We need specific measures, measurable results, reasonable and well thought out answers to today's challenges, and decisiveness to face up to them. That's the only way we can win the confidence of the voters. Thank you.
Tak. And now, Mr. Viegas.
This G20 meeting once again is an anthem to hypocrisy. Given the disastrous outcomes of its policies, the G20 countries represent more than 80% of world wealth, and once again they are trying to square the circle. In so doing, they're trying to have economic growth, deregulation of international trade, and climate change issues put into one basket along with social justice. These lofty declarations may satisfy some people for some time, but they can't hoodwink everybody forever. Financial instability, corruption, social inequalities, and global warming are outcomes of neoliberal policies serving global capitalism. 2, 3 or 20 countries, rich countries, cannot solve these problems. The poor must fight to come up with a progressive and anti-capitalist alternative which can furnish a response to the pressing problems of the planet, to benefit the grassroots, the people, and not to cater to billionaires.
And now, Mr. Oetling.
Thank you. It's good that countries meet to talk things through. It's even good that the EU, for so long as it exists, tags along for the ride. But let's be clear, summits in China are not going to solve the key problems facing Europe, namely economic stagnation and the social disruption caused by uncontrolled, irregular and large-scale immigration from Africa and Asia. So long as the euro remains, growth across its members will be weak. We have had 15 years to find this out, and every year provides us with more evidence. And on migration, Mrs. Merkel seems to expect all the Schengen countries to clear up her mess, and Mr. Juncker thinks national borders should be abolished altogether. The EU's representatives will keep going to G20 summits, but every year they'll be pushed a little further out to the fringes in the family photograph. The awkward truth is that with every passing year, the failing EU and its members count for less in the world. Mr. Moscovici is right to say that the UK will remain a decisive European country in the years ahead. I very much hope that it can be a beacon for Europe, encouraging other European countries to take back control of their politics at a national level and make good use of the extra social solidarity that the nation state provides. Only by harnessing this can European voices command the influence in the world that our great continent deserves.
KAPPEL.
Thank you, Madam President, Commissioner, Representative of Council. On the 4th and 5th of September, the 11th G20 Summit of the most important industrial and emerging countries took place in Hangzhou, and the talks focused on a stronger and more networked and more inclusive world economy, and there was a call for a plan to boost investment, and that is desperately necessary because we see in Europe that investment has still not recovered to pre-crisis levels. We have an investment gap of 400 billion euros, and we have had to drop our growth forecast again this year. There is a clear need for open trade and better macroeconomic coordination, and there was a focus also on digitalization. So yes, these are the right priorities, but I think what is important also was the decision that was taken in the Steel Forum, which needs to propose very concrete measures in the years to come. The conference also focused on the implementation of climate change commitments. China and the US really gave us one of the highlights of the summit by signing up to the Paris Agreement. So they kind of stole the show, but there were other important points dealt with as well, for example, green finance and also tax evasion and intransparent tax havens. There's going to be a list, hopefully, at the next G20 summit. That's something that we haven't managed to do so far, but let's see what the future holds.
Synadinos.
Madam President, the G20 Summit has taken place and takes account of important events such as the Brexit and the attempted coup d'etat in Turkey. Now, Japan is attempting to work together separately with the UK. I wonder whether we can conduct negotiations positively when it comes to fighting against terrorism. Ms. May positively addressed the new requests for negotiation, and maybe Russia could be excluded because its policy has had a negative impact. Erdogan issued a threat to act negatively on immigration, and there was no response. So Mr. Erdogan is free to pursue blackmail. The EU should no longer be exposed to such threats.
And now I'll give the floor to our member, Mr. Hökmark. You have the floor. Thank you, Chair.
Was held in a time that is more uncertain and more riskful than we have seen for decades. It could have been an important meeting in this perspective, but very little came out of it. And what came out of it did so because all the crucial problems that the global world order is facing was avoided. Nothing was really said about Syria, with its global impact not only on refugees but also on stability and security. Nothing was said about Ukraine, with the breaking of international law, an international agreement that is a part of undermining the rules of the world stability. Nothing was said about the need to fulfill Western sanctions versus Russia, who are breaking the international rules. And, of course, the conflicts in the South China Sea regarding the islands was also avoided. And in reality, the issues about the obligations for all the countries to fulfill the need to do changes regarding the climate. And also, Madam Speaker, nothing was said about the need to enhance legal certainty for investments in the global order. We are today facing the undermining of international rules and the respect for international rules. We see it very much in Russia and in China, saying they will not follow international courts' decisions. And the next time when there is a G20 meeting, it will be important for the European Union to be in the lead, to restore the legal certainty and the respect for international rules, because otherwise there is no real meaning of these meetings. Thank you very much.
Mr. Hökmark, there is a blue card for you from Mr. Dzhambazki. Are you ready to answer?
Absolutely.
Mr. Dzhambazki.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Colleague, don't you believe that at this summit more attention should have been given to the role of the dictatorship in Turkey and its role in the migration crisis, and more effort should be put into imposing sanctions on Turkey, which is annexing a certain territory of a sovereign country, I mean Cyprus?
Thank you very much. I think it could have been a good idea to mention also what has happened in Turkey in two ways. First of all, strongly react against any sort of attempt to make a coup d'etat. Because what could have followed that would have been a civic war with a regional disaster, even more than the disaster we are facing. But I think it also could have been said the importance of Turkey coming back to the full respect of civil society and independence. But I think both things should have been said. But the G20 did avoid things that were crucial. And I don't think in the time we are living we can avoid the complicated issues. We need to deal with them, hopefully together, but at least together with democratic nations.
And now Mr. Czarny.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Mr. Tusk because he drew the attention of the G20 participants to the need for greater solidarity, because we are experiencing huge pressure because of migration, and the solution must be a global one. Things are difficult. There are member states in the European Union who do not want to show solidarity towards others on this point. I would also like to thank Mr. Juncker, because he gave a warning to the participants, and particularly the host, that there are problems with steel exports from China. And I think this really was of use to the European sector. And then finally, China has now ratified or intends to ratify the Paris Climate Change Agreement. But I think if then at the next G20 summit we must be more vigilant about the fact that fossil fuels should remain in the soil.
Thanks. And now Mr. Lucke.
Frau Präsidentin. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, this summit fell short of the mark in several ways. It falls short when it comes to free trade. Many European politicians aren't standing up for free trade, but they keep questioning it. The summit fell short if more state expenditure is required without indicating that states are struggling with excess debt and can't finance things. And also, what about fighting against terrorism without talking about the intellectual foundation of terrorism? There's an urgent need to prevent the spread of Islamist philosophy and mentality, particularly in Muslim countries. Salafist and Wahhabistic fighters and Taliban fighters need to be combated. We need to combat them on the social media, and we need to undermine the so-called social work being pursued by these terrorists. The West needs to cater to the needs of religious conservatives so that they do not become violent.
And now Mr. Chountis.
Chair, in the conclusions of the G20 Summit, they repeat their faith in the dogma of globalization. And they also confirm that this globalization is going to be to the benefit of all peoples and countries. This is a desperate attempt to evade responsibilities in the subject of refugees and the crisis in the Middle East, poverty in different countries of the planet, and also the environmental crisis. Commissioner Moscovici, the world economic crisis is featured by many European problems, and the root cause of these problems are the EU's policies of austerity. Their budgetary policy, and the result of all this is that growth is stagnating and unemployment is increasing. This is the policy that's been imposed on the rescued Greece, the Greece of memorandums, with the results that we all know. The conclusions of the G20 for the EU concerning humanizing capitalism or giving it a human face doesn't convince anybody.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, we have heard a wonderful report here which paints a very positive picture. It talks about fair and free trade and fair trade for everyone, and the fact that no one should be left behind in the future. Well, colleagues, if no one is left behind anymore, then we will have resolved all problems, including the migration problem, and you will have fair trade and fair growth for everyone. There is a call also for greater solidarity to be shown in the migration crisis. Well, where is this solidarity now? Frontex is being used as a ferry service rather than as a Coast Guard service, and in Australia exactly the opposite is being done. They are saving the migrants but are bringing them back to their point of departure. Did you talk to the US? The US are responsible for these migratory flows. Millions of how many millions of migrants are the US accepting?
Next one, Mr. PREDA.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to welcome the conclusions of the latest summit of the G20 because emphasis was put on several things which are of strategic importance for the European Union. First of all, there's the question of development and the necessity of effectively implementing the objectives of the Agenda 2030. Now, given that I'm the standing rapporteur in the Parliament on the consistency of politics to help development, I was very pleased to see that the question of political consistency for sustainable development was mentioned in the conclusions, the policy coherence for sustainable development, PCSD. And I think here the EU has a key role to play to promote this concept of policy coherence for sustainable development, and this forum was a good opportunity to express it. Another point was the question of refugees. Of course, the European Union has been hit very hard by this crisis, harder than others. But the solution can only be at global level. We have to see how we can work with our partners to see the root causes of this refugee crisis. And of course, there are political causes. We shouldn't forget the fact that refugees come from countries which don't have democratic regimes and which are very far from the rule of law. So we have to have cooperation there. And in that context, it's true that it was a bit regrettable to see that Russia is back on the international scene and is accepted as a normal partner, even if, as we know, the Crimea is still occupied and Russia is continuing to overtly violate international law. And we see the separatists are encouraged in Transnistria. The other day, the head of the so-called Republic of Transnistria asked for it to join Russia on the basis of a referendum held 10 years ago. There are always consequences of our gestures, so I think we have to remind ourselves that Russia is not a good partner in terms of international law and the rule of law.
And the next one, Mrs. Jongerius.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, I think that you can say that the outcome of the G20 was, on the one hand, encouraging, but at the same time extremely disappointing, because yes, they talked a lot about growth and jobs, but the solutions in the G20 final declaration were very much business as usual. It was supply-side economics and a strict budget policy and a lot of emphasis on reform, although the world is desperately waiting for the opposite, which is demand, demand, demand. The global economy has a lack of demand and low interest rates and the low investment. We need to invest more to stimulate the economy, and unfortunately that was overlooked last week. Investment, both public and private, and room for wage increases are urgently needed, and I hope that next Friday in Bratislava, some attention will be paid to these aspects.
Balczó.
Elnök asszony, köszönöm a szót.
Thank you very much, Madam President. This migration flowing into Europe cannot be just a task for Europe because we have other global players such as the US who bear a lot of responsibility for this. We need to make this message plain, and that was what the EU ought to have done in the G20. I would like to refer from the joint letter of Council and Commission. The partners are called upon to ensure greater humanitarian support so that there is a greater chance for relocation. Donald Tusk already said that Europe is bursting at the seams when it comes to refugees. Let's recognize the facts. The leaders of the EU, particularly Merkel, need to lift their head out of the sand and do what the people want. We need to stand up for our European culture and identity.
Hvala za besedo, spoštovani. V zanimivi razpravi smo slišali, da je bil vrh skupine G20 le deloma uspešen.
Thank you very much, Chair. Well, we've heard that the G20 summit was a success. We've talked about combating tax evasion. China and the United States have ratified the Paris Agreement. We heard about dumping in the steel trade, and we mentioned free trade agreements, etc. And China and Russia finally assumed their share of responsibility for the situation in Syria. Now, concerning the UK, once again we heard President Obama saying to his British counterpart that the UK could not benefit from privileges in the area of trade agreements outside of the TTIP. Then the Japanese government submitted a study to Prime Minister May which talked about the necessity of transferring the activities of the Japanese companies outside the UK given the circumstances. We heard a lot about protectionism, about social dumping, and economic dumping, and this refers above all to the situation in China. So it's important that economic development be inclusive, etc. All of those messages are positive, of course, but it's important to carry them out, and we have to continue the agreements with Canada and the United States.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Madam President. Even the G20 is moving away from the dogma of austerity and is calling for public investment to relaunch growth. And Europe has urgent need of this. It has never been so weak. It hasn't been as weak for decades, even though interest rates are extremely low. It's important that public investment be a guarantee of good quality work and fairness for everyone, but it's also indispensable for the real economy, and this can compensate for a lack in the private sector. We saw the drastic layoffs in Caterpillar in Belgium, where millions of jobs were lost in just a few minutes. People's families' futures are being sacrificed just to pay dividends to shareholders. Caterpillar has been using millions in public subsidies in recent years. It has been sending its profits, however, back to Switzerland, and that was something that was dealt with as well. The G20 Summit is a tax invasion. I think Caterpillar is an example of what is not working well in Europe, and if we cannot evolve towards more social and tax justice, the citizens will increasingly turn their backs on Europe, and I think they will be right to do so.
Now, Mr. Weidenholzer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. Such summits are very tricky indeed. There are great expectations nurtured which cannot be fulfilled. Many of our European priorities are not deemed as priorities on the global level, particularly if you look at the Brexit referendum. From a European standpoint, superficial treatment was given to issues such as migration, financial issues. Migration was only dealt with superficially. Much the same applies to the treatment of terrorism. Illegal arms trade and money laundering ought to be dealt with. If they are not, nothing will budge. Also, then the digital sector has been sidelined. Sustainable growth is something which needs to be addressed in this context. Thank you, Madam President. Commissioner, even if there are no pat solutions from these summits, I think it's important that the major powers reach a consensus on a diagnosis of the major international problems. In this summit, the leaders of the G20 understood that the world is harking back to nationalism and protectionism. Given this, various populations are pointing the finger at globalization for labour problems and so on. The leaders in the final statement said they would fight against protectionism and restrictions on competition. They acknowledged it was also important to acknowledge that globalization is not the same across the board. Developing and emerging economies have enjoyed progress in the reduction of poverty, the cost of living and so on over recent years thanks to globalization. In the developed countries there have been some adverse effects when it comes to precarious working conditions and tax avoidance. The final statement acknowledges the benefits of globalization and say that these benefits need to be broadly shared. But there's no clear commitment made to global rules to offset the negative fallout of globalization when it comes to growth.
Next one, Mr. Cofferati.
So thank you, Chair Commissioner. I would have expected better conclusions in the discussion on the G20. Of course, we need to nurture our economies because without widespread and uniform growth, dramatic social and economic problems suffered around the world will become more rife. But there need to be policies put forward, but there are no consistent policies to have sustainable growth. You need to have rigid environmental standards to be complied with. That is not the case, and the existing environmental standards are rather lax. We also need to have an economic policy based on a common fiscal policy. That's your field of work, and I appreciate what you're doing, but you need to acknowledge the worldwide problems with fiscal policy. production systems have been offset, that there needs to be a change of tack, and Europe can help to resolve the problems that you, Mr. Moscovici, are dealing with. Thank you, Madam President. The conclusions of the G20 when it comes to migration are just a copy and a paste of previous conclusions, previous rhetoric. There are no concrete steps being taken. There's only really one paragraph out of 48 dedicated to migration. Amnesty International said this paragraph was hypocritical. There's a request for a better sharing of burdens among the various countries, but many countries are not shouldering their responsibilities. So this paragraph is hot air. Only 27 countries in the world have regular programs for the relocation and resettlement of refugees, and only 9 of these are part of the G20. I'm not won round by what Tusk said. He said Europe is bursting at the seams. 90% of the refugees are in developing countries. So what are we talking about? We will be more credible in calling for greater burden sharing if we were to do our own homework in our own backyard.
The floor is yours.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne, pani predsedajúca, pán komisár, pán Korčok. Stretnutie lídrov G20 v Číne bolo plné dôležitých tém a dobrou.
The G20 summit has worked on a lot of important subjects, and a lot of important things like world trade and economic matters were discussed. And the point here is to improve people's lives worldwide, not just in developed countries, but also in the third world. That is related to important subjects such as economic growth and also fighting against tax evasion. Diplomatic questions are extremely important as well. For example, relations with Turkey and the migration crisis. A lot of statements were made and there were a lot of promises made, but I can't get away from the feeling that countries are not fully shouldering their responsibilities.
The recent G20 summit in Hangzhou saw several notable outcomes on steel dumping, tax avoidance and the refugee crisis. However, it was the comments made to my own country, the United Kingdom, which were chilling. With the focus of the meeting on economic growth, trade and investment, and with the UK's decision to exit the EU, until the exit is concluded, uncertainty will exist in all of these areas. We don't even know, almost 3 months on since the referendum result, whether the UK's negotiating position will prioritise access to the EU single market. A single market critical to the health of the British economy, critical to British jobs, and I would say critical to Britain's national interest. And then there were the comments made by President Obama that a trade deal between the US and the EU would be a priority over any trade deal with the UK, followed by the intervention from the Japanese that their firms could pull out of the UK if there was no single market access. I urge the British government to listen, to take action and to ensure that Britain can maintain what it has in accessing 500 million consumers in 27 different countries with one single set of rules, ensuring certainty for business and the highest standards for consumers. Thank you, Madam President.
Thanks. And now, Mr. Pirinski.
Thank you, Madam President, Commissioner, Minister. By all accounts, this year's G20 summit was dominated by a new and overriding awareness, the rising anger of people at the ravages that present-day neoliberal globalization has caused in their lives. Media reports have claimed that Australian Prime Minister Turnbull actually called on leaders to quote-unquote civilise capitalism. Some of this awareness has found its way in the final communiqué, and I quote, "Quality employment is at the centre of the G20's domestic and global agenda, together with reducing inequalities and promoting inclusive labour force participation. These precisely are the big issues in capital letters that President Juncker and his Commission must directly tackle with the utmost urgency and full priority, or see the European project disintegrate under the tidal wave of widespread and completely justified popular protest. Thank you.
And the last speaker will be Mr. Turin. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The statements of the leaders and the press statements from the recent G20 summit are a good litmus test for the problems affecting current wildcat globalization. And the declarations also proffer solutions, bolstering the growth agenda, increasing transparency, guaranteeing territorial equality and the impact of economic relations, resolving the refugee crisis and the migratory flows which are not sustainable, fighting against terrorism and facing up to the challenge of climate change. In a world in which there are more and more inequalities which are getting worse and the people are being exploited, the agenda put forward by the G20 calls for those who sign up to it to be more responsible. That's why we in the EU need to provide an example, putting these priorities on our agenda. There is now a greater expectation than ever on Mr. Juncker tomorrow. After blind austerity, we have these populist and nationalist vultures homing in on their prey. Looking at the G20 agenda, we see that this is an agenda on which only a united, cooperative and solidarity-based EU can win through. The path is clear. Let's do what's necessary.
There are 3 persons who want to use the catch the eye. I will give the floor to all of you, 3 deputies. And the first one will be Mrs. Andrikienė.
Ačiū. Kolegos, galime pasidžiaugti, kad G20 susitikimas.
Colleagues, Commissioner, I think we can be happy about the fact that the G20 summit took place in China, but unfortunately no important decisions were taken there. I think really only the host can be satisfied with the result, because it was a further opportunity for him to promote and present his economic model to the world. Canada wanted to become a member of the AEBI, the infrastructure bank in Asia, and only the US and EU are not members of this structure, this organization, and I think there was a lack of a focus on important strategic issues. I'm happy that in the conclusions there was some attention paid to antimicrobial resistance. All international organizations should be involved in the fight against this.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Many topics were discussed at the G20 summit. I think there are 2 intertwined topics, the topic of migration and the refugee crisis and the topic of the economy. These 2 topics were key in my view. I think that we can see some encouraging messages coming from the G20 summit. The fact that the G20 is dealing with the migration crisis shows their maturity. And economic growth linked to the migration crisis, especially from Africa, tells us what we need to do in the coming years. I believe that the European Union should show its strength and unity in this case. Unless we see concrete results and concrete actions, many things will go wrong, and this is not something we want to see.
Mr. Epitideios, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. During the G20 summit, some important issues facing the world were quite simply ignored. the migration and the refugee crisis, for example, and the war in Syria. The G20 summit includes those who hold the main responsibility for these problems, including the Turkish president, who is simply tolerated and is simply allowed to present his proposals on the Middle East. And there were other important problems that weren't dealt with at all. For example, taxation of multinational companies and dealing with social and economic inequality throughout the world. Mr. Moscovici, I would like to point out that geostrategic problems throughout the world cannot be tackled through economic policy measures. We need political measures.
Thanks. And now I will give the floor to Commissioner Mr. Moscovici. The floor is yours.
Merci, Mesdames.
Thank you, Chair and honourable members. Your debate reflects the interest you have in the conclusions of the G20 and, of course, certain frustrations that you feel that I can understand, of course, concerning the way the summit took place and on its conclusions. Now, what we have to be aware of, all of us, and I'm saying that to those who thought we had to cover all kinds of subjects, well, the G20 was created in the context of the economic crisis in 2013 to discuss economic and financial questions above all. So, of course, strategic questions, Syria, these kinds of things were also present in the discussions. And there was a discussion on the role of Turkey in the presence of President Erdogan. But the essential objective was, of course, to assess the economic policy pursued at global level by the largest economies and to reach certain conclusions or recommendations. Now, certain measures were adopted, especially concerning overcapacity, as I said, but the G20, on the one hand, defines signals, which are very important for the world economy, and it gives certain institutions like the OECD missions that they have to pursue. Now, of course, I understand your frustrations, as I said, but we shouldn't underestimate the quality of this particular G20 summit. I mean, we can always expect more. And of course, with your differences of sensibilities, that's only natural. But the G20 is an opportunity to take advantage of global cooperation. We have to demand of our partners that they use this cooperation. It's a question of this solid, complete growth that can give tangible results to the citizens, and then free, fair trade to the benefit of everyone, and finally, a society which is more inclusive. Now, the European Union gives its precious experience to the debate, that is to say that integration, which is the most successful at continental level, and a big single market which makes of us the top economic power in the world, and a political model, a social model, a cultural model. And we shared our experience in Hangzhou through the President of the Commission, the President of the Council, but through the European countries who are present there. And there are quite a few of them there, because they are large economies. And as I said, the results did shore up some of our priorities that converge with them. I talked, for example, about combating tax evasion. This is a subject where, for years, the G20 was the place where a strategy was deployed, implemented thanks to the OECD, with the BEPS initiative, which converges with our own priorities and the action that on behalf of the Commission I endeavour to promote, so that taxation is more transparent and more effective. And we're going to have many meetings on the subject in coming months. It's true, you raised the situation of the UK and Brexit. I'm not going to repeat what I already said, but just one point, which concerns the negotiation of the free trade agreement. There, the conclusion of President Juncker and the reaction of our partners was very clear. At this point in time, the negotiations for the exit of the UK from the EU have not started. We want this to take place as quickly as possible, but of course it takes time to define priorities, to get ready, but not too much time if we want uncertainty to be lifted and doesn't penalize investment and economic activity. Then the negotiations will start, and during all of this time, and the Parliament heard yesterday Mr. King, Sir Julian King, who is to be the Commissioner to represent the UK in the Commission. So during all this time, the UK is a member of the European Union, and as such, it's up to the European Union to negotiate the free trade agreements, and it's up to the Commission to do it on behalf of the European Union. So let's not have a funny functioning for the short time with bilateral negotiations when negotiations between the UK and the European Union haven't even started. And the European Union has its role of initiative taking. Now, talking about Europe, there's an important factor, that is that in December it's Germany that's going to take over the presidency of the G20, which is of course the opportunity for us in the European Union to work with a country of the Union, a major partner in the world economy that shares the priorities of the European Union. So I'm expecting a lot of the work of Mr. Schäuble, the Minister of the Economy and Finance in Germany, during this presidency in preparing the G20, and of course of the German presidency at the summit itself. Now the Commission is going to work closely with the German presidency to prepare the upcoming G20 in Hamburg on the 7th and 8th of July next year. We hope that some of the priority areas where agreement has been achieved that there will be progress made on them quickly, and I will endeavor to see that there are strong priorities laid down, and there's no time to lose. And once again, I wanted to present these conclusions of the G20 as objectively as possible, being aware of the inherent limits to the exercise, even of the undeniable quality of the meeting in its form and in its substance. Thank you very much for your time and your comments, which were more than judicious. Thank you.
Merci, Commissioner Moscovici.
Thank you, Commissioner.
I will give the floor to Minister Korčok. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President, honourable members. Many thanks for all the interventions, comments. They confirm your huge interest in the agenda that was subject of a discussion at G20 meeting in China. Many issues were raised: economic growth, migration, free trade, tax evasion, steel, China, Paris Agreement, many others, and I tried to present how we viewed the discussion on those issues in my initial statement, and I share the views expressed by Commissioner Moscovici when he spoke on behalf of the Commission. All these items are extremely important. We as a Union, I dare say, have a clearly defined interest in those areas. But I think the G20 summit in China has reminded us once again that this is maybe the time for us to pull together as a Union to work on those items in order to have an even better position when we try to protect the interests of the Union and its citizens on the global scene. We are committed as a Presidency to working intensively with you, the Parliament, the Commission, on all the files that were mentioned, so that, as I said, again, make progress and we strengthen our position on the global scene. And finally, two issues were raised which are part of our Presidency responsibility. Mr. Telíčka asked about our further steps as a Presidency when it comes to TTIP. I can say that this will be very high on the agenda of the upcoming Foreign Affairs Trade Council, which will take place on the 23rd of September in Bratislava. And I believe this is the place where we, Member States, together with the Commission, should assess where we stand in negotiations with the United States. And this is maybe, I dare say, the last moment where we should consolidate together our position, look where progress is still possible in in the remaining time of Obama administration, but we are aware that our mandate very clearly says where our offensive interests are, and we as a presidency will do our utmost that these interests are protected. And on the Paris Agreement, that was mentioned also several times, I can assure you that we as a presidency are these days trying to agree on a clear timetable that will allow us ratification of Paris Agreement on behalf of European Union, and it ensures then participation of EU at the upcoming COP22 Marrakesh meeting on global climate change. And finally, I should have said that at the beginning. I came late. I apologize for that. We as a presidency are trying to control the agenda. I found out together this morning that I was not able to control the traffic in Strasbourg, but it was a very nice walk. At the last moment, I had to leave my car somewhere in a jam, and I apologize once again for this. Thank you, Mr. President.
Grazie. Buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning, one and all, dear colleagues. Thank you very much to Mr. Korčok. Thank you to Commissioner Moscovici for that debate, which is now closed. Now, we have the report from Pablo Zalba Bidegain and Gerben Jan Gerbrandy on the inquiry into emission measurements in the automotive sector. The floor will first go to the rapporteur, Mr. Zalba Bidegain.
Gracias. Thank you, Chair. Well, about a year ago, Volkswagen confessed before the EPA of the United States that they were using defeat mechanisms, defeat devices to cheat on the emission measurements and to get the type approval of their products in the United States. Now, the first question that I think we have to ask ourselves is why this scandal wasn't discovered in the European Union. Why in the European Union we weren't capable of uncovering a fraud of such proportions. Of course, the answer isn't easy. But there are a lot of factors that I'd like to debate here today that could explain things. First of all, obviously, there was a lack in Europe due above all to the insufficient integration of our union. I don't have any doubt that if we'd been a real United States of Europe, this scandal wouldn't have taken place. But I'm certain too that if we'd been the United States of Europe, our consumers, the millions of Europeans who use a car every day, would have been better protected. But I don't have any doubt either that if we had a single legal system, the consumers of the European Union, no doubt, would be better protected. There's another factor which might explain why we found ourselves in this situation. There's no doubt that we've got a vague legislation under Commissioner Verheugen can explain why we haven't been capable of uncovering the scandal. And what's even more important, why this scandal was able to take place. And then I think we have to do soul searching because Commissioner Verheugen did negotiate here with some of our colleagues legislation with time has demonstrated to be insufficient. Then Commissioner Tajani arrived, and he endeavored to delay things while he tried to adopt ambitious legislation to reduce NOx emissions, at least. But we're aware of discrepancies. There was a report adopted by this Parliament of the discrepancies between the real driving emissions tests and the laboratory tests. And the question is, did we do enough? Well, I think we have to look at the future, and what the citizens of Europe want of our Committee of Inquiry is for us to investigate the truth. But what's even more important, that we make proposals to promote measures which prevent frauds like this taking place, and I have no doubt that all of my colleagues will agree that we're going to try to achieve that. Now, of course, crises are opportunities, and this is the opportunity that the automotive sector needed to adapt to realities in a 21st century, which is much more demanding concerning emissions and trying to find new ways of transport. And we have to realize that the incomes of 12 million families are at stake. We have to be strict enough not just to guarantee the income of those families, but above all, to try to give them a better future. There's no point recognizing that we should have recognized the fraud. That's one thing, but we have to reveal the truth. But the most important thing is to look toward the future. It's been a pleasure to work with my Dutch colleague, Mr. Gerbrandy, and I look forward to working with him for the next few months, along with the rest of my colleagues and the shadow rapporteurs.
Thank you, Rapporteur. The floor goes to the other.